Okay, so I'm joined by David Matlow, who is the foremost collector of Herzl memorabilia in the world. And I guess the first question that many people would ask is, I collect stamps or I collect coins, I collect action figures. When I was a boy, I collected Smurfs. Who collects Herzl memorabilia and why?
Well, first, thank you for having me. Greetings from Toronto, Canada. It's an excellent question. There are very few of us who collect Herzl memorabilia. I've had a fascination with Herzl since I was a kid. We used to visit my grandparents in Israel. They moved to Ramat Gan in the 50s, and I was born in 1960. And on one of our visits in 1966, so this was before Jerusalem was unified, we went to Jerusalem, and my parents took us to see Herzl. And I just know this because I found a picture of myself and my sister beside Herzl's grave. So it means that Herzl was a very important person to my parents, and I know for my grandparents. In fact, in their home in Ramat Gan, there was a portrait of Herzl. And when my grandmother died in 1991, I asked to have that portrait, which I do have. That was item one in my collection. It also ties to my fascination, it's a lifelong fascination with where the state of Israel came from. Because on May 13th, 1948, there was no Israel. On May 14th, 1948, at about 4:30 p.m., there was an Israel. And it didn't just fall out of the sky. There was a lot of work and preparation and planning and sacrifice. And so that takes me to Herzl, because Herzl really is a metaphor for the longing, the planning, the dreaming for a Jewish homeland. And as you said, people collect coins and stamps, and I collected those things as well. And here in Canada, hockey cards and memorabilia. I've always collected things. I've always been interested in Herzl, and then these two streams of my life coincided about 20 years ago, actually, with the advent of the personal computer and doing searches and finding Herzl items from around the world. And from that, it grew from the item one, which I mentioned from my grandparents' home. And that just proliferated. Everything that I do to a great extreme. So now I have this very large collection. Some of it you see in behind me in archival boxes, and it's literally all over our house here in Toronto.
And you have 5,000 or so items, is that correct?
Correct. I've been saying 5,000 items for the last 4 or 5 years, but during the pandemic, I have been working from home, and my wife is here with me, and she sees the number of FedEx packages and the light coming, and she says, you got to be way more than 5,000, if only for the number of packages that have been coming to the house for the last couple of years. So it's at least 5,000, but I've lost track. I have more than 1,000 postcards, for instance. I have a couple hundred coins and medals, thousands of books and pamphlets, hundreds of posters. So it's at least 5,000. But who's counting?
You mentioned Canada and the hockey connection, and obviously in the film we saw that you had the bobble-headed Herzl hockey players. Is that the quirkiest item in your collection, or is there something even more out there?
Well, that Herzl bobblehead I actually made myself for a program. I'm, believe it or not, a lawyer at a major law firm in Toronto, and we had an event called the Herzl Cup, which is a hockey tournament. So I had those bobbleheads made, and I use them as part of what I call the Herzl Project. It's my one-person initiative to talk about Herzl, tell the world what he did, to inspire them to be a little bit like him. Use your skills and talents to help the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And here in Canada, if you want to catch someone's attention, you say you connected with hockey. So Herzl didn't play hockey, had no knowledge of hockey, didn't care about hockey, but that's where that came from. But in terms of a quirky item, the quirkiest item I have, and I love this is one of my favorite pieces, is this one, which is a label for Dr. Herzl brand sardines. These are Norwegian sardines, which are packaged in Chicago by the Oriental Fisheries Company. And I often wonder about the the leadership of this company meeting with their advertising executives and saying, I've just imported these barrels of small Norwegian salty fish. What's the best way to sell them to consumers in the Midwest of the United States? And someone says, I know, let's name them after Herzl. So Herzl brand sardines, and really, some might say that was disrespectful for a person of the importance of Herzl, but I think it was just a way of the owner of this company to continue to perpetuate Herzl's name and his dream and the vision for a Jewish homeland. So
Would that have been,
that's the
would those have been produced during Herzl's lifetime, or was that after Herzl's lifetime that somebody came up with the Herzl sardines?
My research suggests that it was from the 1920s or so. Herzl died in 1904, but there were many items with Herzl's likeness on it during his lifetime. Herzl he lived from 1860 to 1904, and only the last 8 years of his life were dedicated to the Zionist dream, his vision for a Jewish homeland. And his work was done mostly in Austria, which is where he passed away in 1904. But he sat for portraits. There's a famous picture of Herzl on the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel taken in 1903 at the Sixth Zionist Congress. He understood that he needed images and he needed ways to inspire the Jewish people behind his plan. His plan was for there to be a homeland for the Jewish people, which to us is now axiomatic because it's existed, I dare say, for the whole lifespan of you and me and many of the people watching this webcast, if you're younger than 74. But it was a crazy new idea. So he knew that he needed images to inspire the people, and he became one of those images. And he was like a superstar to the Jewish people. Here's an item in my collection. Well, so that's a picture of Herzl on the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel. There were no cell phones, so this was a staged photograph. But what's interesting is this one is signed by Herzl, which means that somebody bought this postcard and went up to Herzl and asked him to sign it, just like, at least around here, we would do for hockey players and baseball players. He was a superstar and such an inspiring figure that people wanted his picture or an item with him on it. And this particular person sought Herzl out to have him sign his own picture.
But it seems to suggest from what you're saying that Herzl himself was branding Zionism as Herzl Zionism, and he saw that he should be the face of it and literally had to be the face of it, in much the same way as, there would be other kinds of Zionism, but Herzl Zionism was the way forwards. He was the Coca-Cola compared to the Pepsi-Cola of Zionism.
He knew he needed to brand this, and he became the brand. At the same time, people had suggested to him that his form of Zionism, which was political Zionism, there were all different kinds of Zionism. There was the Zionism, there's religious Zionism and socialist Zionism and revisionist Zionism, which didn't exist at the time. But his version was political Zionism, which was to get a charter from the local government, which at the time was the Ottoman Empire, to enable a country or a homeland to exist, as opposed to practical Zionism, which had been practiced for 20 years or so. Have a few people in, create a town here, create a village there. But people suggested not calling it political Zionism, but calling it Herzlian Zionism. And he said, no, it's not personal to me, and it needs to outlive me. And he was prescient in that regard because he died at 44. But after he died, the Zionist movement needed to keep his dream alive. And by putting his image on so many things was a way to keep his dream alive. So in community halls, there were portraits of Herzl. People had busts of Herzl. In my collection, I have pocket watches and ice tongs and forks and spoons and all kinds of things with Herzl's image on it. It was one way to keep the dream alive and to show your connection to that dream.
Okay. So going back to the collection, you've got the poster or the portrait from your family in Israel. You've got the sardine label. You've got the hockey bobbleheads. What, though, is your most prized Herzl piece of memorabilia?
So it's a good question because, like our children, we love them all, but this is a particularly unique piece. So this is a locket that hung on a chain. It belonged to Fanny Wolfson. Fanny Wolfson was the wife of David Wolfson, and David Wolfson was Herzl's successor when he passed away. So you would open, this is a little pencil, it would open up, and inside is a little autograph book. And I don't want to flip the pages because I don't want the pages to fall out, but on the top is an autograph from Benjamin. Benjamin is Herzl. His Hebrew name was Binyamin Zev Herzl. Often he signs T.H. Herzl or just Herzl. And in this book is autographs of the major Zionists at the time, Max Nordau, Israel Zangwill, Katznelson, other such people, which meant that this woman, Fanny Wolfson, went and asked people to autograph this book, but also that there were parties and galas in support of the Zionist cause that she went to, not very different from the way that funds are raised or programs are inspired to this day. And so that, to me, and this may not resonate as much in Australia as when I say it here, it's the Zionist equivalent of a baseball signed by the 1927 New York Yankees. It's got all the superstars in one document.
Right. Now, talking of memorabilia, we're celebrating the 125th anniversary of the first Zionist Congress. Have you got any actual memorabilia from that Congress?
I do, and I've been looking through it in anticipation of this momentous anniversary. So Herzl had this idea for a Jewish homeland. He wrote his book, Der Judenstaat Medinat HaYehudim, the Jewish State, which was published in February of 1896. And by August of 1897, he had convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel. So at the end of August, there will be a celebration of that anniversary. And so I've gone through my collection to identify some of those things from it. And what was important about the first Zionist Congress is it was the first time in 2,000 years that the Jewish people got together from around the world. I don't think there was a delegate from Australia in 1897, but there was from Canada either. There was not, but there were about 5 from the United States and from Palestine and Eretz Israel and all over Europe, and they got together to begin to talk about our own collective future as a Jewish people, and that's where it was determined in what became known as the Basel Program that the aim of Zionism is to secure a Jewish homeland, a homeland for the Jewish people, secured by international law in Palestine. So a couple of the things I have, and this was. It's a little bit glary, so I apologize. This is a letter written in Hebrew. Yeah. Rosh Havad, the head of the committee, was Herzl, inviting people to come to Basel for a Congress. So this went out in the spring of 1897. And it essentially said, we're having a Congress and please come. And this particular letter, and there's versions in German and English, but the Hebrew one says Hebrew will be spoken there, and there are kosher restaurants in Basel. So if you're worried about kashrut, not to worry. When you got there, you received a delegate card. So this was not schlocky. Like, this was well organized, and picture it, without the benefit of the internet or mass searching functions, Herzl was, in the span of 3 or 4 months, was able to identify leaders of what wasn't called the Zionist movement until that Congress, but people who were partial to the idea of a Jewish homeland, because these types of sentiments existed. There were the Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zionism, etc. before that. So he identified them, and 200 came. And when you got there, you received a delegate card. This is a delegate card for a gentleman named Heinrich Lowy. But you can see, again, in terms of branding and imagery, what was on the card. Individuals praying at the Western Wall, the Kotel, as well as a farmer planting his crops. And the idea of having Jewish farmers owning land and planting, working on the land, owning land was a novel idea. The delegates received, and this is an original, it's very rare. Apologize for the glare. A pin that had that fluffiness around it. Try and make it closer. Was blue and white, but the pin itself was the idea that Herzl had for a flag. And I hope you can see it. It's a Magen David, obviously. It had little stars on each of the corners and the Lion of Judah in the middle. And so delegates were able to receive this. All of the delegates, Herzl was a playwright. He was a lawyer like me, but unlike me, he stopped practicing law, but he used all his skills and talents and threw it all at this dream of a vision for Jewish homeland. So he envisioned the Zionist Congress as, in a sense, street theater, that the delegates to the Congress were not just the audience, they were actors in this drama, which was intended to be performative to bring about the creation of the Jewish homeland. And he insisted that everyone who came to the Congress wear a tuxedo. As my mother used to say, you want to be taken seriously, dressed seriously. And it was also about transparency, because at the time, and even to this day, there's suggestions that the Jews in the back room kind of do funny business. So he wanted to make sure it was transparent. Everything was out in the open. The press was invited to be there. And the delegates were photographed and included in a composite picture. And this is a pretty famous composite. That's Herzl in the middle with the largest picture. And it's hard to see, but the bottom row is 13 women. At the first Zionist Congress, women were observers. They were not fully voting members, but by the second Zionist Congress, they were fully voting members. And at the time, the only country in the world that gave women an equal vote was New Zealand. In Canada, voting didn't start for women until 1918. In the United States in 1920. I don't know in Australia, but this shows the progressiveness of the Zionist movement. People don't think of it now as being progressive because it's immersed in the conflict. But equal votes for women. Herzl wrote about free medical care, free education through to university, freedom of the press, total equality for everyone, workers' rights, workers' compensation, and a 7-hour workday. And back to this pin that I showed earlier, the 7 stars in this pin, so there's 6 on each corner plus the one in the middle, was designed by Herzl, reflective of one of his key ideas, was that there would be only a 7-hour workday. You would work in the Jewish state. You would work for 3.5 hours. You would have a 3.5-hour break because work would take place in 2 shifts. And in that break, you would be with your family. You would increase your education. You would rest. You would have recreation. And you'd go back for the second 3.5 hours. And this is at a time where in England and the United States, the average workday was 10.5 to 11 hours. So this was a really progressive idea. And the last item for the Congress I wanted to show, and this was on the subject of transparency, all of the, everything that was said in the Congress was minuted, so you could read it. An English translation of the first Zionist Congress just came out in the last year or so. And this is a printed version of Herzl's speech, which was printed in Vienna in 1897. Again, this was one of the first motions at the Congress to help spread the word, right? It wasn't carried live on CNN. You had to spread the word of what was happening. And so that was one way that they decided to do that. And this was quite momentous. People will be observing the anniversary of the First Zionist Congress, and they know about the picture of Herzl on the balcony at the Sixth Zionist Congress, and that was the last Congress that he was alive for. But there were 22 Congresses prior to Israel's independence. There was planning and arguing, of course, but also a lot of work and effort and organizing. And that Zionist Congress has continued. The 38th Zionist Congress was held virtually last year, I think, during the pandemic. So that system continues. The First Zionist Congress created the World Zionist Organization, Democratic Constituent Organization. I assume that your organization is part of the World Zionist Organization, which was created by Herzl all those years ago.
Now, I guess a question that a lot of people have is, if Herzl hadn't existed, would Zionism have evolved anyway, or would somebody else have taken up the baton and been Herzl in place of Herzl?
Obviously, we never know what would have happened had something that did happen not happen, but as I mentioned previously, there was the idea of a return to a Jewish homeland. That the Chovevei Zion movement, Lovers of Zion, existed, I think, since the 1880s. People had talked about it. Pinsker wrote Auto Emancipation. Moshe Hess wrote his book, Roman Jerusalem. There was, by 1897, a number of farming communities, Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva, Rosh Pina, which they called, as I said, practical Zionism, bibs and bobs. But Herzl's perspective on it, which, if you think about it, 50 years is not a long time in the span of history, from his conceiving of the idea as articulated in the Jewish state in 1896, the Zionist Congress in 1897, the UN partition resolution that created a Jewish state in Palestine was in November 1947, and it was established in 1948. So in 51 or 52 years, it actually happened. And we all know, with the benefit of history, it happened 10 or 15 years too late.
Right.
But it wouldn't have happened at all, in my view, had Herzl not taken up the mantle. And his major contribution is establishing an infrastructure of a state in creation.
Right.
So Herzl identified the issue of anti-Semitism in his lifetime, in university, when he was the reporter that covered the Dreyfus trial in 1895, which was a very famous trial in Paris, where a Jewish officer was wrongfully charged and convicted with espionage on behalf of the Germans. He experienced anti-Semitism. He felt it. He knew about it, and he was deathly scared about the future of the Jewish people in Europe. We, of course, now know how right he was. But instead of just kvetching about it and moaning about it and saying, well, I wish someone would do something about it, this gentleman went about to do something to change the situation. And again, not just writing about it, but creating the Zionist Congress, which was effectively a parliament, a democratically elected parliament for a state that did not yet exist. Create the World Zionist Organization, inspired the creation of the Jewish National Fund, the Keren Kayemet L'Israel, which was established at the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1901. To buy land, to plant trees, inspired the creation of the Jewish Colonial Trust, which was an early iteration of an investment bank that supported development and the purchase of land to create communities. The land that became Tel Aviv was purchased with land from with funds from the Jewish National Fund through the Jewish Colonial Trust. All these things, an infrastructure of a state in creation. And so that's the difference from the differentiating factor of Herzl from the others who had the idea before him is actually use his knowledge of law and economics and drama and communication skills as a journalist, marketing, which we talked about, to cause this idea to take place. So I don't.
Do you think? Sorry. I was going to say we've talked about whether it would have happened without Herzl. Would it have happened without the Holocaust?
Well, there's those that say the answer that there wouldn't have been an Israel if there weren't a Holocaust. To flip it on its head, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust had there been an Israel. It wouldn't have. So it's a difficult question. The need for a Jewish homeland existed in 1897, existed as a result of the pogroms in Europe. Kishinev in 1903 would be one of them. It is required today because of the anti-Semitism that's being experienced, and as a refuge for Jewish people wherever they may be. Ukraine, for instance, now, we're concerned about what's happening in Russia with the rattling chains to close the Jewish agency. When the Jews of Argentina were in peril, there was just an airlift of Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from France. So the need for Jewish homeland exists. So I believe it would have happened because the need is there. This was the Holocaust, of course, was the worst by many multiples of example of the extent to which anti-Semitism creates danger for the Jewish people. But sadly, it's not the only one. And so had it not been for the preparation, starting with Herzl, right, there was an infrastructure of a state in creation in Palestine at the time. There was the Jewish agency that had been created. There was like a Jewish administration, school systems. There was the beginning of an army with the Haganah and the Palmach and the other factions. So there were preparations. There was medical systems, thanks to Hadassah and other organizations. So there was the investment and the care and passion of Jewish people all over the world to allow the state of Israel to be born and to stay alive, notwithstanding its invasion by all the Arab armies in the War of Independence. So had that planning, that's why I said earlier, it just didn't fall out of the sky in 1948. It was the result of all this planning and effort. And as I also said, sadly, the effort culminated 15 years too late. But its need and its necessity exists to this day. And sadly, the reason why Herzl thought we needed a Jewish homeland, his book, the Judenstaat, was a modern solution to the Jewish question, which is anti-Semitism. I'm not an expert at all about whether there is an issue of anti-Semitism in Australia, but there certainly is in Canada, in the United States, and around the world. So the need for the Jewish homeland that Herzl envisioned continues to exist. We all know in the back of our heads something that wasn't available to the Jews of Berlin in 1938, that should things turn terribly bad, wherever we live, we have a place to go. And that place needs to be protected, preserved, nurtured. It's not perfect. Our country, Canada's not perfect. I've been to Australia a couple of times, so it's pretty perfect. But so a resident would have a different, would know it in a more nuanced view. It's not perfect, but the Jewish homeland. But part of this Herzl project that I've embarked upon is to talk about Herzl and to inspire people to be a little like Herzl, as I said, use your skills and talents to make it better. Don't throw up your hands in frustration. I don't like this government. I don't like this policy. I don't like what's happening at the Kotel. I don't like that there's 5 elections in 4 years. That's a luxury to be able to have the opportunity to do something about it, for Jews to make a decision for ourselves or at least the citizens of Israel, about themselves to protect themselves, which had not been available for the history of the Jewish people from 70 AD until 1948.
Now, you say part of the reason for your kind of passion is to get people to be like Herzl. One of the points that comes across very strongly in the film is that Herzl basically sacrificed everything, his family, and he squandered the family wealth, and his children suffered, and his wife suffered, because he was so obsessed with the Jewish state. We kind of revere him, and you obviously see him as some kind of hero, but was he really a hero, or was he really this terrible man who abandoned his family in pursuit of this dream?
It's a good question, and when I suggest that people should be a little bit about Herzl, not all of his elements, he was so committed to this idea that his family paid a huge cost for it. And we see that a lot for business executives, sports player, whatever it might be, actors who are so passionate about what they're doing that some of the more important things in life, like your family, are sacrificed for it. So I don't recommend that part. And we all have multitudes. There's different elements of our persons, and so that the story of his children is tragic, as reflected in the film. But from a hero point of view, it meant that he was human. He's not some superhuman. He was a person like us, and we all have our good features and our less skillful features. And so if one thinks that Herzl was he was a Superman, and what he accomplished could only be accomplished by perfect superhuman people like him, the answer from in the film and in readings of Herzl is that it's not true. He was a human like us. He had his less virtuous characteristics, which means if he's human and accomplished such amazing things, all of us who are equally human have the potential, have the capacity to accomplish fantastic things. So we don't have to simply say the work of changing the world, the work of improving our little world, the Jewish people, our local communities. We can't ignore that we live in local communities too, and so we should help that too. And the work of helping to secure the safety and future of the state of Israel is not just left for superhuman perfect people. It's the work of all of us. So that to me is the lesson of Herzl. It doesn't diminish his stature in my mind. It elevates it, and it elevates the incentive or the potential for all of us, because none of us are perfect. But nevertheless, we all have the potential to make a difference.
One final question. As you mentioned before, it took just 50 years between the First Zionist Congress and the State of Israel actually being declared, which is an incredible achievement in such a short space of time. This year we're celebrating 125 years since the First Zionist Congress. Next year, 75 years since the establishment of the State of Israel. Obviously, Herzl couldn't have foreseen the incredible leap forward in technology that Israel itself has pioneered. But to what extent does the State of Israel that we see today reflect the state of Israel, or the Jewish state, that Herzl himself envisaged?
Herzl wrote two books. We talked about the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which was written in 1896. In 1902, he published a second book called Old Neuland, Old New Land, which incidentally, when it was translated into Hebrew, was translated as Tel Aviv. And the city of Tel Aviv, founded in 1909, is named after Herzl's book. An Old New Land. It's creating a new society, which in the book is called the New Society, in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. And why Tel Aviv? Tel is an archaeological site, old, many layers. Aviv is springtime, and so new and old. And in that book, Herzl describes, through a kind of meandering story, his view of what the Jewish homeland would look like all the way in the future in 1923. And he talked about things like telegraphic newspapers. Well, what's a telegraphic newspaper? We would see it perhaps as the internet. Obviously, he wouldn't have envisioned that. Perhaps it was radio. He conceived of electric cars like Teslas. He conceived of there being great medical breakthroughs coming from the Palestine, the Jewish homeland. He conceived of communal farming, freedom of the press, great culture, that from the new society, whenever there was a crisis in the world, a flood, a tornado, an earthquake, a call would come to Jerusalem and people would go out from there to help, which happens with Israel and organizations like that. We see Israeli presence in Haiti, for instance, when there's an earthquake. A thriving democracy. So I commend people to read Alt Neuland, Old New Land, because there are many things that are that he envisioned. He also envisioned that the Jews and Arabs in the society would live peacefully together. And so that happens in certain small settings. The big picture of a conflict between Israel and its neighbors that has persisted certainly since independence, 1948, but there were riots in 1926 and in the 30s, etc. But that's just a moment in time. The world is changing. So Herzl envisioned that the Jewish state would live in peace, and that, as I said, is a work in progress. With the Abraham Accords, with Bahrain and the UAE and Morocco signing on, and things getting better with the Saudis. Like, who knows? Egypt, of course, and Jordan from decades ago. That Herzl's vision of a Jewish state living in peace, which of course is what we all want. It's supposed to be a safe homeland for Jewish people and a place where everyone can live and do their own thing and live in peace and thrive and prosper, look after their families like we all want. That remains a work in progress. And Herzl said about Zionism is that the way he envisioned Zionism, and he didn't create the word, but he created the organization, is not just about getting a plot of land, but of creating a model society on that land. So a model society, and we'll all have different perspectives of what a model society is, but people living in peace, being able to do their own thing, working together, healthy, happy, without the concerns of war or terrorism, is something that Herzl would have wanted. That's still not here yet, but it's certainly much closer today than it was 5 years ago. So the span of history is long, and this is a project that is still being written. The Jewish state that Herzl envisioned is not fixed, it's evolving. And going full circle, the Herzl project encourages people to continue to stay on that train and help the ongoing evolution and improvement and progress and safety and security of the Jewish state and Jewish people wherever we live, Canada, Australia, and all points in between.
David Matlow, thank you very much.
My pleasure.